let's discuss 3 hacks to crush live cash games. Right now, if you walk into any casino that has a poker room, you will find that the cash games are booming. You can find a seat, you can play a game, you can get in the action, and if you're playing small stakes there, like 1-2, 1-3, 2-5, something like that, you know that big win rates are possible. Many of my students are winning 10 big blinds per hour or more right now in live cash games, and I want that for you. And in this webinar, you're going to learn 3 hacks to crush live cash games, which are to exploit your opponent's pre-flop. A lot of people just play GTO ranges, and that's a mistake. Next, you're going to learn flop strategy to crush these weak players. And finally, we're going to be discussing a few river strategies to really print all the money. So let's get right to it. Hack number 1, pre-flop. Realize that GTO strategies are an excellent starting point. I'm all for GTO poker, I'm all for studying, and I'm all for learning how to play well. But if you really want to make the most money in your games against your opponents, you have to exploit them. You have to take advantage of whatever it is they do wrong. So what does that mean? And what do you need to do? Well, first, identify the weak players. When I say weak, I don't necessarily mean tight and passive. I mean players who just play poorly, right? You want to identify the players who play poorly, and then focus on playing pots in position against them such that you get to take advantage of whatever it is that they do incorrectly. And you're going to find that very often against most players who don't really 4-bet a whole lot pre-flop, as most people do not 4-bet very often in live cash games, you should be 3-betting a lot. If you look at GTO charts like we have on pokercoaching.com, you'll see that quite often you have a decently wide calling range, but against players who are going to call your 3-bet with all sorts of marginal stuff and never or rarely 4-bet bluff you, you should be 3-betting with a good, strong linear range, which basically means your best hands. If you look at a GTO chart and it says 3-bet something like pocket jacks and better and ace queen and better for value, and then some junky bluffs, which will often be the case in GTO world, good player against good player, against a player who's going to raise too wide, call too often, not 4-bet enough, you want to be 3-betting way more linearly, even in position, with maybe something like pocket 7s and better, and ace 10 and better, and king jack and better, something like that. Maybe a little bit wider, even with some suited connectors if they're not ever going to 4-bet you off of them. However, against other players who are going to raise too wide, but then fold too often to aggression, because they think when someone 3-bets them, they just have the nuts, you're going to want to be 3-betting polarized, but perhaps with even more bluffs than normal. Because imagine if your opponent's going to raise with a normal range, but then fold too often, the obvious exploit is to try to make them fold more often with pre-flop aggression. So you're going to be 3-betting them with more bluffs. So you see, we can have players who both play poorly, but we're going to be exploiting them in very different ways. So make sure you are doing that. Also, finally, you need to stop going broke against nits before the flop. Players who only put their money in with the nuts probably just have the nuts whenever they want to load their money in, right? So if they are going to be 4-betting with only aces, kings, queens, and ace king, well, hands like pocket jacks and hands like ace king go way down in value. So many times people come to me with a hand where they get ace king pre-flop, which is normally fine to get it all in for 100 big blinds. But if their opponent literally never bluffs pre-flop with some ace x suiteds or ace queen or something like that, you don't want to get it all in with the ace king. And if you look at our GTO pre-flop cash game charts at Poker Coaching, you will see that very often, especially when you get deeper and deeper, ace king does not even 3-bet pre-flop sometimes. It does not 4-bet a lot of the time. And that's because if your opponents are playing kind of a tight strategy, which to be fair isn't all that bad in a cash game with a rake and no ante, you don't want to be getting it in with hands like jacks and ace king. And that's even more true if your opponents are never 4-betting or 5-betting with any sort of bluffs or overvalues. So realize that these hands are good most of the time, especially if a medium amount of money goes into the pot. But if your opponents who are reasonable or tight want to put in all their money, you have to be very cautious. Hack number 2 is to stop slow playing big hands. Too many players get fancy play syndrome. They think that the way you win at poker is by outwitting your opponent and making some tricky play and setting a trap and having them fall right into it. But in reality, when you have a good hand, stop being tricky and start building a pot. You want to make the pot big with your big hands. And the small stakes, you will win big money by getting maximum value from your big hands because a lot of people just don't like to fold. Let's take a look at some examples here. Here we have Queen, Jack of Spades. This is a hand someone sent me, and they want to know what they did wrong. They raised it up with Queen, Jack of Spades, playing 1-3 no limit. From the hijack seat, the big blind calls. Flop comes. Queen, Jack 4. Big blind checks. This is a spot where you should definitely bet. They told me in the comments that, you know, I have a queen and a jack, I block their good hands, what could they possibly have? Therefore, I'm going to check it back. The problem with checking it back here is that, well, they could actually have a whole lot of stuff. They could easily have a queen. They could easily have a jack, even though we do block those. They could easily have a straight draw with king 10, king 9, 10-9, something like that, right? They could also have a lot of flush draws. So this is a spot where, yeah, you block the top two pair, but you just want to load money in the pot because they are going to have a queen sometimes, and they are going to have a jack sometimes, they are going to have a decent draw sometimes. So you want to put money in the pot. This player check, though. On the turn, the big blind checked again. Now they start betting $12. I would perhaps advocate even betting bigger. This is a situation where a lot of people check it back on the flop with ace highs, and then they decide to bluff it on the turn, or they check it back with a hand like pocket sixes, and they make a big bet, which may or may not be a good play. But people do that kind of thing, and if your opponent does have a queen or a jack, they're not going to fold. And right here, if they actually do have a draw of some sort, like a flush draw, you don't really want to give them amazing pot odds to continue. So we probably want to be betting bigger in this situation than $12 into 21. Whatever. Opponent calls. Rivers a 2 of spades. Big blind checks. Easy bet. Again, I would go medium or big at this point. We're trying to get called by a queen or a jack. We go 20. I'd probably go a little bit bigger, but whatever. This is the most reasonable bet size we've used so far. The opponent does call, and they show the king and the queen. Oh my gosh. So right here, notice if we just bet flop, bet turn, bet river, we'd have been able to get an additional $40, $50, $60, $70 into this pot in this situation, while also giving us protection against all the hands the opponent has that have some equity. And instead, we didn't do that, and we won the pot. And this player who sent me this hand, they felt pretty good about this. They think that they won a nice pot, and they were happy about it. But in reality, this is kind of a disaster, because if we miss out on $40 or $50 or $60, that's 10, 15, 20 big blinds that is staying in our opponent's stack and therefore not ours. This is a big mistake. The right play here is just to bet the flop. Just bet the flop. Let's take a look at the spot where someone showed me a hand that they played well, I think. Low jack raises, we defend with pocket fours in the big blind. Flop comes jack 9-4. Definitely check raise. When there's a flush draw and a straight draw on the board and you have pretty much anything besides top set, you usually want to be check raising. When I say anything that is, I think anything that is a good strong value hand. So jack 9, jack 4, 9-4 suited if we have it. Pocket 9s, pocket 4s, you want to check raise. Even with pocket jacks on this board, I don't hate check raising in a cash game. The problem with check raising top set is that you really do block your opponent's continuing range, but not here. Because if you think about it, the low jacks don't have a lot of straight draws and a lot of flush draws, right? And still some decent jacks. So I think I would be check raising the vast majority made hands in this situation, recognizing maybe my check calling range is a little weak, but such is life. I just want to play big pots with big hands. So we're going to check raise, and we're going to check raise kind of big. The opponent bet 10 into 21. We go to 35. I think that's good. This is a situation where whatever the opponent has some equity a lot of the time, or it's top pair, and that's not going to fold. So we just want to get money in the pot with what is almost always the best hand. Opponent does call, turns a 2 of spades. Just bet again and bet kind of big. Just want to load money into the pot. We go 70 into 90. Can we go bigger? I don't hate it. When there's a double flush draw on the board, I typically do like using quite big sizes. I think if we go 90 here, might be a little bit better. I think that could be nice. We could also bet 90 with some high equity draws and some junky draws. The opponent now goes all in for 255 total. Easy call, of course. We could be beat by sets, but whatever. You cannot be sad about stacking off. Some players are definitely afraid of stacking off, by the way. They'll get shoved on here and they'll think, well, if you're shoving, you must have top set or middle set, so I guess I have to fold. But no. If this person has ace jack or king jack on this draw heavy board, a lot of people just rip it in because they realize that my range should have a lot of draws in it, right? I mean, I literally just told you, it's good made hands and draws, right? And they don't want to get outdrawn. So a lot of people will shove with jacks or better in this scenario, a jack or better in this scenario. And against that range, we're in obviously fantastic shape. So easy call. Opponent this time showed up with jack 10 of hearts. I think they probably should have just called. There's some rivers they can fold on, I think. But whatever. We call it off. We get it in good, and we scoop a nice pot. But notice in the first hand, we slow played. We won almost nothing with top two pair. This time we check raised, and we got to play a big pot. The alternative here would be to check call flop and then check raise turn, but you're going to find that whenever you check raise turn, that makes a lot of people kind of afraid. I think people realize that when you check raise the flop, you will naturally have a whole lot more draws and thin value hands in your range compared to when you do check raise the turn, and to be fair, that's usually what you should be doing. So I'm a big fan of just putting money in the pot. When you have a good hand, put money in the pot, especially when it's kind of likely your opponent has something. All right, hack number 3, go for thin value and fold to a ton of aggression. 2 different exploits here on the river. The players who win the most money in small stakes games have one great skill in common, and that is that they are willing to let their ego go and fold on the rivers whenever they have a hand that's probably good some portion of the time, but not when their opponent wants to load the money in. If you never get bluffed, you're calling too often. It is okay to get bluffed. You should be getting bluffed some portion of the time. Not all the time, of course. I'm sure some people are going to take this to the extreme. You can't go around folding bottom set, for example. But this is a situation where if your opponents want to load their money in, you need a really good hand because most people don't bluff nearly often enough. In addition to this, you're going to find that the best players value bet in situations where others will check because they're too scared of facing aggression. A lot of people do not go for thin value. A lot of people simply just don't bet the river often enough, and when they do, it's almost always heavily tilted towards extreme value, or they're polarized, usually with too few bluffs. Here we have the pocket eights. Let's take a look at this pocket eights hand, where we raise with pocket eights. Big blind calls. Flop comes 10, 7, 2. Big blind checks. We should probably continuation bet. We do go 13 on this relatively dynamic board. Fine. Maybe a little smaller is fine. Probably doesn't make much of a difference. Turns a 5 of hearts. Opponent checks. At this point, we should probably check it back and try to get to a showdown. Check, check. If we bet the turn and get called or raised, it's not great at all. We could easily be against a 10 and drawing thin. River's a 2. Opponent checks. Seems like an easy spot to bet to me. We have the best hand in this situation a decent amount of the time. Not always, but a decent amount of the time. But if you consider what our range looks like in this scenario, we're going to have a lot of unpaired overcards that don't mind bluffing. So if we have a lot of unpaired overcards that don't mind bluffing, we want to make sure that we are bluffing some of those, but also value betting kind of thinly to compensate for the fact that we are bluffing with unpaired overcards some portion of the time, like Queen Jack. So this is a spot where we need to make sure we are value betting somewhat thinly, and when it does go check, check on the turn, we don't actually have a ton of 10s. So if we don't have a ton of 10s, what are our next best hands? Well, pocket 9s, pocket 8s, ace 7, king 7, stuff like that. And those hands should definitely be betting in this situation. I do realize we have a few 2s with like ace 2 suited, but pocket 8s is one of the best hands we can have in this situation. And in the opponent's shoes, they're going to check raise some 10s on the flop, and they're going to bet some 10s on the river. So they're kind of lacking 10s too. So if we're both lacking 10s and better in general, pocket 8s is kind of the nuts. We want to put money in the pot. We do go for a $30 bet. Opponent does call, and we win. That's a situation where a lot of people just check it back because they are deathly afraid of getting check raised. But listen, you may get check raised here some portion of the time against loose, aggressive, battling opponents, but most people are just going to check and call with their 7s and their pocket 6s and maybe even some ace highs because they realize, hey, a lot of draws missed, and my opponent's going to feel inclined to bluff with lots of stuff. All right, button raises. We call with Queen Jack offsuit in the big blind. We flop top pair, pretty good. We check, the opponent bets 12 into 17, easy call. Turns a 9, we check. They bet 32. So right here, we have a pair with an open-ended straight draw. Pretty good hand. A lot of people look at this and think, check raise, put in money. We either have the best hand or we're drawing live. The problem, though, is that I'm not even sure we're drawing all that live. The opponent could easily have King Jack. They could easily have Jack 8. We block those, but it's a situation where when the opponent bets the flop and the turn, they start to become pretty polarized, right? So what is a polarized betting range in this scenario? It's going to be good draws, which are jacks, which we block pretty hard. And then good made hands and better. What's a good made hand on this board? Maybe king, queen, and better? Well, given we block the draws and king, queen, and better is crushing us, we definitely don't want to put too much money in this pot. We can't go around folding top pair with a straight draw here, but we do have to be a little bit cautious. Now, I'm sure in GTO world, the opponent's supposed to be betting with some random king highs. Like a lot of king highs, probably, because a king high has a gut shot and an overcard. And that's sometimes all it takes. Also, in GTO world, the opponent may be going for thinner value than only king, queen, and better. They're also going to be bluffing with some low equity bluffs, probably with an 8, right, for the bad end of the gut shot. So if the opponent's going to be betting overly aggressively on this turn, then your hand goes far, like way, way, way up in value. Anytime your opponent's finding an adequate number of bluffs, top pair's good, right? You just don't fold top pair when there's an adequate number of bluffs on the turn or the river. But what I'm saying is exploitatively, a lot of people don't bet the turn often enough with draws. I mean, put yourself in the opponent's shoes. If you have the king 2 suited or the king 6 suited, are you betting 32 on the turn? Some of you will be, but I can guarantee you if I polled you all honestly, it won't be everyone, and I'm pretty sure that's going to be a pretty logical bluff in the spot. So that's a good reason to be a little bit cautious, right? If most people are not bluffing in this scenario. Easy call, though, on the turn. River's a 7 of diamonds. We check. Opponent bets 120 into the 105 pot. They overbet it, leaving themselves a sprinkle behind. I'm not going to say we should read into leaving them leaving themselves with a sprinkle behind or not. I will say, though, that exploitatively, if you see your opponent, let's say, bet all in when it's reasonable with the nuts and then leave a sprinkle behind with a bluff, that's probably a big tell that they have. And if you can find big tells like that, obviously exploit them. But not knowing anything, when most people blast the river, they just have a good hand and they're trying to get value. So which hands are going to be trying to get value? Do we beat any of those? The answer is obviously not. They're probably not blasting the queen 8. So we have a bluff catcher. What bluffs make sense? Well, hands containing a jack, but we block the jack. So even though we have top pair, I think this is a pretty easy fold on the river. And you all know me, I don't really like to fold. Against most people in most small stakes games, though, this is a spot where a lot of people call every single time thinking, well, I have top pair, what can I do? Top pair with a straight draw. The straight draw doesn't really matter on the river, besides the fact that it has a blocker. And this is a spot where I think we have just a super easy fold. It's not even close. We fold, we let it go, we move on with our lives, and we don't know what the opponent has. That's okay. You don't have to know what your opponent has. Like I said, though, the best players are willing to let their egos go and fold rivers, especially in spots where their opponents want to load in the money. So that's it. Those are 3 hacks to crush live cash games. Again, number 1, use preflop exploits to print money. Number 2, stop slow playing big hands, especially on the flop and the turn. And number 3, go for thin value, but also be willing to fold to a ton of aggression. Hope you get in there. Hope you battle hard with your opponents and use these 3 hacks. And if you do, your win rate is going to skyrocket. That's going to be it for today. If you enjoyed today's video, do me a favor. Click the like and subscribe buttons down below. If you have a player, a friend, are there friends in poker? If you have a poker friend who plays cash games, who could use these tips, please share this video with them. Good luck in your games. Have fun. Thanks for watching. And I'll talk to all of you next time.